Welcome. Do you crave dark fantasy, sword and sorcery? Look no further, for I bring ye a tale torn from the pages of Savage Realms Monthly. And if this tale merely whettens your appetite, then click the magic link in the description. The glowing runes will take you on a journey to their secret library. But be warned, once you start reading, you might not be able to stop. Tonight's story, God of the Mountain, by Willard Black. Redgar reclined on a pile of silken pillows, his feet stacked on a low table, a flagon of good Ashurian wine in one hand, and two Mainu girls on either side. He was a giant of a man with a mane of sun-bleached hair, broad shoulders, and powerful limbs. Other patrons threw curious glances in his direction. Most had never seen a Hathor before. As remarkable as the man was, his sword was even more impressive. It was a massive weapon, almost as long as Redgar was tall, with a blade 2 hands wide and eldritch runes etched in the battle-scarred steel. The small playhouse was crowded with Suks, Ashurians, and the occasional dark-skinned Keshite. It smelled like strong tobacco and stale piss. The show was a better-than-average rendition of Lilies on the Water, and the actors weren't shy. The crowd cheered at the nude parts. A Raji man walked in and caught Redgar's eye. He wasn't the type normally found in a bawdy playhouse. His grey beard was neatly trimmed. He wore expensive silks and gold rings on every finger. He pressed a handkerchief to his nose and scanned the crowd. His eyes fell on Redgar, and he started over. Redgar passed silver to his companions, and they moved off in search of another dupe with too much coin and drink. The Raji man took their place and spoke through the perfumed handkerchief. "They say you are a man skilled at finding lost things, and you have some experience with a blade." Redgar took a swig from his flagon, no sense answering. The Raji would get around to what he wanted sooner or later. Redgar waited him out. When it was obvious the barbarian wasn't going to answer, the Raji said, "I am Iveshek. I have need of a man such as yourself." "How much?" Redgar asked. 100 gold sovereigns," said Iveshek. "A princely sum," Redgar said. "Who do you want killed?" Iveshek shook his head. "I have no need of an assassin." "Then what do you want, man?" Redgar thrust his chin at the actors on stage. "It's getting to the good part." "To the west, beyond the Sagara River, lay the vast and untamed jungle kingdoms of Kesh. There you will find a volcano called Unmaktu, which the Keshite people regard as sacred. At the foot of the volcano is an ancient temple to the deity Okahar, where the pagan Keshites practice all manner of vile deeds in service to their dark gods. Until recently they kept their devilry inside their own borders." Redgar snorted. He was a Raji speaking ill of the Keshite gods when the Raji had more gods than you could count on both hands. Iveshek signaled a serving girl for wine and continued. "The belly of the great volcano rumbles, and the Keshite people must pacify their god with the blood of a virgin." Iveshek paused, waiting for Redgar to express outrage, but he only grunted. He wasn't particularly impressed. He had heard worse. Hell, he'd done worse. 3 days ago," Iveshek said, "Keshite warriors raided a ship bound for the Tsuchau Isles. They put the crew to the sword and escaped with 12 prisoners. The captives have been taken into the dark heart of the Kesh jungle to be sacrificed on the night of the new moon. In 1 week's time." He leaned forward. "My daughter is among them." "You want me to fetch her for you?" Redgar said. He inclined his head. "And the other captives?" Redgar asked. "Save them if you must. I care only for my daughter." Iveshek said. I told her this journey would end in disaster, but she is headstrong and foolish. Still, she is my daughter. Save her, and you will be richly rewarded. Redgar said. Put half the coin on the table. Iveshek snorted. How do I know you won't disappear with my money? I'll give you 10 gold now. The rest you will get after you have saved Natalie. He dropped a purse on the table. Redgar heard the satisfying clink of coin. How will I recognize her? Iveshek took a locket on a gold chain from around his neck and showed Redgar a small painting of a Raji girl with dark eyes and white teeth. My daughter, Natalie. Redgar set out before daybreak. The journey took 4 days. He rode hard across the barren plains of the Ashur-Sukal, through the great city of Tehet, with its basalt towers built atop green hills rising from the land, like arthritic knuckles, and from there he bought passage across the Thagara River. He sold his horse before crossing. The animal would do him no good in the thick jungle. The ferryman warned him of Keshite savages before shoving off, leaving Redgar alone on the sandy beach. Beyond a trackless wilderness of swamp ash and bald cypress, Redgar glimpsed a volcano rising in the distance. A thin black ribbon of smoke drifted from the mountain's peak. It was a day's journey as a crow flies. With his giant sword balanced on one shoulder, he plunged into the dense tangle, but the jungle proved more difficult to navigate than even he had guessed. Hundreds of waterways filled with crocodiles and cottonmouths slowed his progress. Vines formed impenetrable walls, forcing him to take long detours. Several times he had to climb a tree for a view over the canopy to be sure he was still headed in the right direction. Evening had fallen by the time he reached the feet of the volcano. He was drenched in sweat and covered with insect bites. The moon was a slim, white crescent in a black velvet sky full of incandescent stars, and the volcano groaned, spitting gouts of flame into the air, casting crazy shadows over the jungle floor. Finding the captives proved easy enough. He followed the sound of drums. An idol had been carved into the side of the volcano, a towering statue of porous grey rock, shaped in the image of a fierce deity with the body of a man and the head of an elephant. At the feet of the idol was a long stone dais, 10 feet high and twice as long. A stone stair led to the top, where a naked girl knelt between 2 bronze braziers. The light from the braziers reflected on her olive skin. Her hands were bound behind her back, and there was a leather collar around her neck. A thick metal leash tethered her to the stone tablet. Redgar brought out the locket, squinted at the picture in the faint light of the fires, and felt reasonably sure the girl atop the altar was Natalie. She was to be the sacrifice. Redgar retreated a safe distance, hunkered between the roots of a large swamp ash, and settled the naked blade across his thighs, waiting for his chance. The rest of the captives were chained to the pillars, holding up the altar. Their situation was grim. Keshite savages defiled the women, while bonfires burned high into the night, casting the macabre celebration in a ghastly red glow. Drums drowned out pleas for mercy. The Keshite chieftain sat on a throne draped in animal fur. A simple loincloth was tied around his waist, and scars crisscrossed his naked flesh. He watched the proceedings with bored indifference, a king upon his throne. Redgar would kill the chieftain if he got the chance. There was no better way to test a man's mettle than a fight to the death, and the chieftain was no ordinary man. He was tall and lean, with sinewy muscles reflected in the firelight. The festivities lasted late into the night, while the volcano continued to grumble. Before the first light of day broke the eastern horizon, the Keshites had thoroughly despoiled their victims and were passed out naked on the ground. Even the chieftain had joined the celebration and now lay stretched out near the foot of the idol. The fires had burned down to embers, and smoke rose in thick white plumes. The sharp scent of charred wood lingered in the air. Redgar stirred from his hiding place, flexing his arms and legs, getting blood back into cramped limbs. Here was a chance to rescue the girl and get away unseen. He crept to the edge of the wood and waited, watching the sleeping savages to be sure none of them were awake and playing possum. When he felt it was safe, Redgar stole across the open ground, pausing long enough to snatch an animal skin from the chieftain's throne. He mounted the steps 2 at a time. Natalie lay on her side, with her knees pulled up to her chest. Her black hair was a tangled mess. She gasped and sat up as Redgar approached. He silenced her with a finger, and draped the animal skin over her shoulders, then examined the chain holding her to the altar. The collar was leather and simple to remove, but with their hands tied behind her back, Natalie was helpless to do it herself. He opened the leather buckle and laid the chain down gently, so that it would not rattle. Natalie opened her mouth to speak, but Redgar warned her to silence. He untied her hands, leaned close, and whispered directly into her ear. "Stand up and get the feeling back in your arms and legs. We may need to run." She nodded, understanding, and climbed to her. The top of her head barely reached Redgar's chest. She had high cheekbones, dark eyes, and a simple gold ring in her nose. Her limbs were strong and slender, a girl in the bloom of youth. She massaged her wrists and neck, flexing her fingers and toes. Redgar waited as long as he dared, then steered her toward the stair. A dark-skinned Keshite with a pair of hooked blades in either hand appeared at the top of the steps, gave an ululating warning cry, and threw himself at Redgar. Redgar sidestepped the attack and took the savage's head off with one swipe of his giant blade. A bright red shout of blood sprayed from the stump of the man's neck, and the head went tumbling down the stairs. Natalie shrieked at the sight of so much blood, and the whole tribe came awake. Within seconds, the foot of the stairs was blocked. The other captives pleaded for rescue. Redgar cursed and bared his teeth. He gripped his sword in both hands and planted his feet. The savages charged. Their warbling cries split the air. Redgar killed them with mighty swipes of his sword, his muscles flexing beneath his pale skin. Bright red blood flew in wild arcs. Keshites died, screaming. Their bodies littered the steps. What they lacked in skill, they made up for in sheer numbers. They mounted the stone stair and crashed against the Hathor like ocean waves against rock. Redgar fought until his arms ached with the effort of swinging the giant blade. He gasped for breath between each crashing breaker of Keshite tribesmen. His chest heaved and a vein stood out in the center of his forehead. At the bottom of the stair, the Keshite chieftain pushed his way through the crowd. In one hand he wielded a spear stained black with the blood of his enemies. In the other he carried a long shield covered in animal skins. The chieftain called out to his nearest warriors, and they mounted the steps 5 abreast, intending to surround the Hathor. Redgar couldn't fight all 5 at once. He might kill 2 or 3, but they would cut him down. It was hopeless, but if he was going to die, he was going to take the chieftain with him. A good death, Redgar told himself. Too bad about the girl. He spat, brought his sword up in both hands, and roared in challenge. Before the Keshites reached the top of the steps, the volcano erupted in an earth-rending explosion of fire and rock. The cries of the dying and the wounded were drowned in an ear-splitting crack of thunder that seemed to go on and on without end. The volcano, it seemed, was not content to wait for the full moon. Black smoke and molten lava spewed into the air. The ground trembled, the carven pillars cracked, and Redgar felt the stone vanish from beneath his feet. The altar crashed to the ground with a deafening boom. Redgar and Natalie joined it at a moment later with a bone-jarring thud. A dozen Keshites were crushed beneath the falling altar, while others screamed and ran. The stone stair still stood, but now it led to nowhere. Red-hot lava spit from the volcano and ran in glowing orange streaks down the side of the mountain. Small rocks rained down like flaming arrows, killing and maiming. Redgar groped for his sword as a lava rock snapped against the stone between his feet. Natalie was on her hands and knees, coughing, covered in ash. She had lost the animal skin, and her hair was a wild black mane, colored gray with soot. Redgar grabbed her arm and hauled her toward the tree line before the chieftain and his warriors could recover. They crashed through the underbrush, headed in the direction of the river. Branches and palm fronds slapped their arms and legs. Redgar could only go as fast as Natalie could run, naked and on bare feet, and already he could hear the sounds of pursuit. Keshites called to each other as they searched the jungle, and judging from the number of voices, Redgar estimated more than a dozen pursuers. The chieftain would be among them. He splashed through a shallow stream of muddy water, then up a steep bank. Natalie used her hands as well as her feet. They emerged from the trees and found themselves at the edge of a cliff. To his left, Redgar could see the dark ribbon of the Thygara River cutting through the landscape. Behind them, half the jungle was on fire. Each passing moment brought the hungry roar of the flames closer. Redgar bared his teeth and cursed. Natalie bent over with her hands on her knees, gasping for breath. "What's wrong?" "We turned too far south," Redgar told her. "We'll be lucky to reach the river without having to cut our way through the chieftain and his men." He leaned out over the precipice. It was a difficult descent, even for him, and he doubted the girl could make the climb. He couldn't carry her and the sword. He started along the ridgeline and barked at Natalie to follow. She jogged to keep up. Falling ash had turned her naked body gray, and tears streaked her cheeks. She asked, Who are you?" "My name is Redgar," he told her while searching for an easy descent down the hillside. "You're a Hathor?" she asked. "You mean a barbarian?" "You said that, not I." One side of his mouth turned up in a wry grin. Up ahead he spotted a gentle slope that she could easily manage. What was easy for the girl would be easy for the Keshites. But what choice did they have? She said, "Why do you rescue me?" "Your father hired me." "My father?" she said, struggling to keep pace. "My father has been dead many years." "Well, someone hired me," Redgar told her, not caring at the moment to puzzle out the who or why. "Who?" "I couldn't care less, girl." Redgar put a hand on the small of her back and shoved her toward the slope, and said, "Hurry!" A black-skinned Keshite warrior burst from the jungle with a shrill cry. Natalie screamed, lost her footing, and went rolling down the hillside. Redgar turned and parried. Steel met steel in a flash of sparks. Redgar kicked the Keshite's knee, heard a meaty snap, and the man's leg bent the wrong way. The Keshite hissed in pain, and Redgar split his chest open with a vicious swing of his sword, then turned and bounded down the slope. Natalie came to rest in a creek of clear running water. She sat up, blubbering and spitting. She had cuts and bruises, but no broken bones. The water had washed away the ash, and her long black hair hung in wet tangles. Redgar stamped across the creek bed, took her hand and hauled her up without stopping. The volcano belched another gout of fire and ash into the dark skies. Hot rocks hissed and snapped all around them, severing branches from trees and lighting small fires. The ground bucked and heaved. They were still several miles from the river, by the Hathor's reckoning, when they stepped into a jungle clearing to find the chief and 2 of his warriors waiting for them. The Keshites knew the land better than Redgar and had taken a shorter route through the jungle to come out ahead of them. He let go of Natalie's hand. She tried to latch onto his forearm, but he shrugged her off and strode into the clearing with his knuckles white on the hilt of his giant sword. The chief and his warriors came forward to meet him. Redgar circled to his right. He wanted to snare them up, force them to maneuver around each other, and prevent all 3 from attacking at once, but the chief had other plans. He shoved one of his warriors forward and used the distraction to his advantage. Redgar hacked the Keshite warrior's head off with a mighty swipe of his sword, while the chieftain circled around and attacked from the side. Only reflexes born of countless battles saved Redgar's life. He slipped sideways and deflected the spear thrust. Then the other warrior was on him. Redgar ducked the curved blade and smashed the Keshite's nose with the heavy pommel of his weapon. The bone broke with a wet crunch, and the Keshite warrior went reeling. His nose gushed blood. Redgar cut him down and spun in time to block another attack from the chieftain. With his 2 warriors dead, Redgar now faced the chieftain in single combat. He grinned and raised the sword. The chief sprang forward, trying to drive his spear through Redgar's heart. The Hathor retreated, giving ground to his enemy. He was focused on defending, waiting for the chieftain to provide an opening. The fight ranged around the clearing while the volcano thundered and shook. Redgar was breathing heavy by the time the chief finally raised his shield a little too high, exposing a naked thigh, and Redgar struck. His blade cut to the bone. A shock of red blood pissed from the opening. At the same time, the chief's spear licked Redgar's sword arm. He hissed in pain, and the giant blade slipped from his fingers, landing with a heavy thud on the soft earth. The chieftain, thinking he had won, dropped his shield and charged Redgar with the spear. The barbarian sprang aside, one hand clutching the bloody gash on his forearm. He circled the only tree in the clearing, trying to keep the trunk between him and the flashing spear tip. But a root caught his heel, and he sat down hard. The chieftain drove his spear straight for the barbarian's heart. Redgar rolled. The spearhead stabbed dirt, came out, and stabbed again, forcing Redgar to keep rolling side to side or be spitted. While the 2 warriors fought, Natalie groped for a rock, crept up behind the Keshite chieftain, and smashed the stone against the back of his head with all her strength. His skull caved in with the muffled chock of rotting fruit dropped on stone. His eyes rolled up, and the spear slipped from limp fingers. He fell face first, landing on top of Redgar. Black clouds blotted out the sky, and fiery stones rained down, impacting the ground with whistling cracks, splintering trees and digging divots in the earth. Fire raged through the jungle, spreading quickly from the feet of the volcano toward the river, crawling closer with each passing moment. The air was a thick gray smog that made breathing difficult. Redgar pushed the dead Keshite chieftain off him and struggled to his feet. Natalie, naked and dirt-stained, dropped the bloody rock. Her small chest expanded and contracted with each labored breath. Redgar nodded his thanks. She started to return the nod and coughed instead. He stripped the dead chieftain of his loincloth and tied it around the girl. While he cinched the cloth tight around her slender hips, she laid her head against his chest. He couldn't tell if she was in shock or exhausted. He said, "Can you run?" She nodded. He reclaimed his sword, took her small hand, and set out for the river, hoping the girl could keep pace. They would be lucky to reach the shore before the fire. A white-tailed doe bolted past, leaping narrow waterways and weaving between trees. Redgar could feel the heat at his back. It was like standing in front of a furnace. Sweat drenched his skin, and smoke clogged his throat. Natalie staggered and retched, beating her bare chest with a tiny fist. He pulled her along, but without clean air in her lungs, her legs slowed. Her eyes were tear-filled slits. She stumbled over roots and divots until Redgar scooped her up in one arm and tossed her over his shoulder like a sack of grain. The powerful muscles in his thighs screamed with effort, but he reached the water's edge ahead of the flames. On his left, a burning palm tree toppled into the water with a boiling hiss. He splashed ankle-deep into the muddy Thagara River and halted. The water was 4 miles wide at this point. Redgar could swim it, but not with the sword and the girl on his back. While he weighed his options, Natalie started hammering him with small fists. "Let me down!" she cried. Redgar dumped her unceremoniously in the water. She landed with a splash and came up sputtering, ignoring her protests at such rough treatment. Redgar went to the nearest swamp ash and hacked off a heavy branch with 2 powerful strokes. He grabbed the tree limb and hurled it into the water, then told Natalie, "Swim." She pushed dark tangles of hair out of her vision. "What?" Redgar jerked her to her feet, turned her toward the floating branch, and gave her a shove. Swim! She got one arm and then the other over the bobbing tree limb and started kicking with both feet. Redgar turned back to the ash and hewed off another branch for himself. Then he was in the water beside her, paddling for the opposite shore. Behind them, glowing lava reached the water's edge with a mighty roar of steam.
"Will the water," Natalie panted between breaths, "hold back the fire?"
"Let us hope so," Redgar told her. They paddled in silence. The far shore drew slowly but steadily closer, and the bloated corpse of the doe floated past. The sun rode across the sky, and the volcano finally ceased its grumblings. They were halfway across, treading water and letting the current carry them, when Natalie asked,
"Who hired you, I wonder, and how did he know of my predicament?"
"When a man offers me 100 gold sovereigns, I don't ask questions," Redgar told her.
"Can you describe him?"
"Have you ever seen a peacock?" Redgar said. "He was tall and thin, with rings on every finger."
"The man you met is called Ivashek,"
Natalie told him.
"He is an enemy of my order."
"Your order?" Redgar asked. A wave slapped water into her open mouth, and she spat it out.
"I am keeper of the sacred fire, an acolyte in an erudite order of the arcane."
"You speak of sorcery," Redgar said. "Are you a witch?"
"I'm no witch, you simple-minded buffoon. I study ancient lore."
"I'm Hathor," he said. "I have no gods and distrust sorcery. My people worship Mount Hothmere beyond the Frost Gate."
"The Keshites worshipped a mountain as well,"
Natalie pointed out. Redgar didn't bother to respond. He had sacrificed young bulls at the foot of Mount Hothmere, not out of fear or reverence, but because it was expected. He didn't see any harm in it, but never saw any benefit either. Rain fell on the crops whether bulls were sacrificed or not. Maybe virgins fetched a higher price from the gods.
"Ivashek is a servant of Moloch,"
Natalie told him.
"They destroyed our monastery on Tanthus and set fire to the archives. I escaped along with a dozen other acolytes. Now I'm the only survivor. If Ivashek catches me, he will use my knowledge for some dreadful purpose I do not yet understand."
When Redgar did not answer, she said,
"Did you hear me?"
He nodded.
"Will you turn me over to him?"
Natalie asked. "That depends," Redgar said. "Will he pay me?"
"Have you no honor?"
Natalie asked. "Absolutely," Redgar told her. "I made a deal. I plan to honor it." Redgar crawled up the riverbank exhausted and gasping for breath. The powerful muscles in his thighs were in painful knots. He pulled himself out of the water and rolled onto his back, allowing the sun to warm his tired limbs. And he waited for the girl to try her escape. She crawled up from the water on hands and knees, took a moment to adjust her sodden loincloth, then sprang to her feet. She made 3 long strides before her legs cramped and she fell flat on her face, howling in misery. Redgar guffawed. "Where are you going?" he asked. She massaged the back of her slender thighs, her brow pinched in pain.
"You're a cruel man."
"Is that so?"
"You should have let the Keshites kill me,"
she said. Tears welled up in her dark eyes.
"Ivashek will do worse."
Redgar closed his eyes, enjoying the warm sun on his bare skin. "What would you have me do instead?" She took a long time to answer.
"You are strong and brave. Take me as far as Sukali. A man like you would surely find a way to prosper in those wicked cities."
Redgar grunted. He had traveled plenty throughout the Sukalai region, and Natalie was right. He did prosper. "And what do you hope to do there? Convert the Suks to your monastic lifestyle?"
"You mock me,"
she said.
"It's not enough that you will abandon me to fate worse than death. You mock me as well."
She dashed tears from her eyes.
"I was right. You are a cruel man, no different than Ivashek."
Across the river, the entire jungle of Kesh was a raging inferno. Thick black smoke blotted out the sky. Redgar laid on the beach until his skin was dry and his muscles had regained some of their strength. Then he took Natalie by the arm and hauled her up. She rose with a pout. Let her sulk, Redgar thought. He forced her to walk in front along an ancient highway laid down by some long-forgotten race. The years had washed away all evidence of the road in places. All that was left was chunks of stone hidden beneath the sand that caught at their toes and threatened to trip them. They passed ancient ruins of Cyclopean architecture as the sun moved slowly into the west. They hadn't made the outskirts of Tahet before Redgar's ears perked up at the beat of hooves. The road was narrow at this point, not much room to move in a fight. There was a thick tangle on the left and a high embankment on the right. Redgar took Natalie's arm and halted her march. She started to ask why, and then heard the riders.
Please, she said. Please, I beg you to reconsider.
Hush, child. He swung the sword down off his shoulder and stabbed the point into a gap between loose paving stones. The pommel reached his chin. Redgar rested a forearm over the crossguard and waited. 5 horsemen rounded a bend in the road. Ivashek was at the head of the column. 4 hard-bitten men armed with swords and maces followed. Redgar waited until they pulled rein and said, "Do you have my gold?" Ivashek pulled a heavy leather pouch from his saddlebag and lobbed it underhand. Redgar caught it and tucked it into his wide belt.
"Give me the girl,"
said Ivashek. "You hired me to save her from the Keshites," Redgar said. "I've done that. So far as I'm concerned, my part in this affair is finished." Ivashek narrowed his eyes. His horse tried jigged to one side, and he yanked on the reins.
"Then you won't mind stepping aside?"
Natalie looked up at him with eyes full of tears. Redgar took stock of the hired muscle, sizing them up. Their mounts snorted and stamped, a sure sign that their riders were nervous. He turned his head to the side and spat. "Don't think I will," Ivashek said.
"You got your gold?"
Redgar nodded. "I did."
"Then what business is it of yours?"
Ivashek asked. Redgar shrugged. "I don't particularly like you." Ivashek's nostrils flared, and his lips peeled back from clenched teeth. "Kill him!" None of the riders moved. Ivashek turned to a big Ashurian with a wiry black beard and said, "I'll double your fee." The Ashurian swung down out of the saddle and hooked an iron mace from his belt. Redgar waited for him to get within striking distance before taking up his sword. The Ashurian charged. Redgar gave ground and countered, waiting for the man to overextend himself. It was a short exchange. The Ashurian lunged, and Redgar hacked his head off with one powerful swipe. The severed head bounded over the paving stones, and the headless body sagged like a marionette with its strings cut. Redgar, barely breathing heavy, wiped his sword clean on the dead man's leather vest. The rest of the hirelings wheeled their mounts, and Ivashek was left alone, his long face contorted in rage. "Damn you, barbarian! You have no idea the affairs you're meddling in. Has she told you who she is? What she is?" Ivashek's wrath turned on Natalie, and the muscles in his jaw flexed. "Enjoy your victory, child. The savage cannot protect you forever." "Enough," Redgar said, and strode forward with his sword raised. "I tire of this talk." Ivashek turned his horse and fled. Natalie threw her arms around Redgar's waist, and her small body pressed against him. He waited until Ivashek had disappeared, and said, "What will you do now?" She stepped back, wiped tears from her eyes, and said,
"I must reach Sukalai. I could use a stout man to see me there safely."
Redgar shouldered his sword and thought for a while, in the slow plodding way of his kind. There were questions of right and wrong to think about. Civilized societies had their own peculiar sense of justice, which seemed to shift with the winds. But to the Hathor, justice was fixed and immutable. Yet Redgar did not like to mix up in the affairs of wizards, and Ivashek had a sinister feel about him. He had lied right from the start, but if Redgar abandoned the girl now, she would be in Ivashek's clutches before dark. He made up his mind and motioned to the dead Ashurian. "Clothe yourself, girl. We can make many leagues before nightfall."